here with the GreenPath Psychotherapy team, same team as last time. So thank you for joining us. And today we're going to be talking all about boundaries. I think this is a hot topic. I think because we use them everywhere, but sometimes we don't really know what they mean. And obviously, in interpersonal relationships, it can feel kind of uncomfortable to set them. So today we're going to be talking about what boundaries mean, when to use them, and maybe some of that guilt that comes up when we do experience or implement boundaries. So, first question here, like, let's start with what is a boundary? How do you define a boundary?
I really like Nedra Tawwab's definition, where she says boundaries are expectations and needs that help you feel safe and comfortable in your relationships. Expectations in relationships help you stay mentally and emotionally well. Learning when to say no and when to say yes is an essential part of feeling comfortable while interacting with others.
Did you memorize that or was that?
No, I'm reading on the screen right
Oh,
now.
okay.
Got my cue card.
Sounded like it came straight from you, but that is good.
I also think about boundaries as like where you begin and the other person ends, right? Like that's the boundary, right? And so figuring out between like, what is this person's autonomy and what is my autonomy? And where is there a point of like conflict within those two positions? That's where you build the boundary.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And so that's how we define the safety. It's like where I'm feeling maybe unsafe within a relationship with someone.
And this is a very, let's say, overlapping, let's say, way of looking at boundaries, but from the starting point of like what does the boundary protect, right? And I think answering that question comes with some level of reflection in terms of, let's say, one's values, right? The kind of person that they want to show up as in relationship. So in that respect, no two people's boundaries, let's say, are the same. And maybe sometimes in, let's say, pop culture dialogue around the idea of what boundaries are, there's maybe a tendency to sort of think of them as like what's appropriate for one person is appropriate for every person in terms of a boundary to set. But I mean, it goes back to the emotional safety, like that in and of it, understanding what makes you feel safe, understanding the kind of relationships that you want to have. They go back to, let's say, certain values about how you want to see yourself in relationships, right? So it starts with that reflection. That's the way I look at it, because that is fundamentally what the boundary is there to protect.
I would also say that, like, the way that I see boundaries or define boundaries is, it's what you need in order to have healthy relationships with others and yourself, and also helps you to prevent, eventual resentment from potentially porous boundaries. So that's how I would sort of look at it.
I think a big piece too to differentiate here is like when I'm setting a boundary, it's what behavior do I need to change or implement without expecting someone else to do that, right? Like it's, and how strong or rigid do I need to be with those boundaries? Like what is the context? How often am I implementing that boundary? I think the piece though, because it is so individual, it's like, I think that's why we get uncomfortable with it though, right? It's like I'm creating a boundary for myself and what I need to change, but that doesn't necessarily mean that other people will agree with that or other people are doing it. And so that does run the risk of, maybe alienation is like the worst case, but also even just like judgment or people not respecting that boundary too, right? So when do we implement these boundaries? Like what are some like context, some examples that you can kind of think of that would be a good kind of place to set these boundaries?
What I would say is that when you notice yourself, and I think this like has a lot to do with connecting to your body and what's coming up for you when you're around a certain person or in with certain situations. So paying attention to when you're noticing like patterns of feeling really guilty or feeling maybe shame or feeling maybe like your energy is being taken away from that person or something like that. And paying attention to what about it is bringing up those feelings. And then it might mean, if you're having a conversation with somebody and like sharing that and they're not willing to compromise, then that's when we have to kind of go inwards and look at ways that we can control the situation, which may mean that we need to set that boundary for ourselves, which, it's not about trying to control somebody's behavior through that boundary, but rather how do you move through the world? How do you behave in a way to protect yourself and your energy?
Yeah, I think I agree with you. Like, I think it's about what you're willing to accept and not accept and in your life, right? Like in terms of like, certain behaviors or certain things that are comments or whatever, and setting a boundary and then enforcing that boundary. Because that's really about, like it is a request to the other person, but it is your boundary that you have to hold in place, right? So they can try and cross it 100 million times, but it's how forcibly you're going to hold it in place.
Mhm.
I think you two have highlighted a point of like we need them everywhere, but there's other situations where they're more black and white. Like if you think of school, you have like a syllabus that outlines like the educator's role, your role, those kinds of things. In the workplace, you have manuals and different policies. It's really hard for clients and relationships to like define those for themselves. And so what you said, noticing the way your body reacts, what John Lucas said, like what are your values? Like how does that show up in this particular relationship? That's really important.
Yeah. What comes to mind for me is when do, let's say, boundary related questions and issues tend to come up, at least in the context of people's, let's say, lives, obviously relationships, work. But oftentimes it's sort of in interpersonal therapy, which is a mode of therapy, has this idea of role transitions, which is basically the idea of interpersonal tension arising from just by the sheer, development of one's life, transitioning, let's say, roles. A young adult moves out of his parents' house and maybe moves in with their significant other. And so that's a role transition, not just vis-a-vis the partner, but vis-a-vis the parent-child relationship, right? And so that's a way of looking at where so often, let's say, boundary related issues come up because it's your roles change in life and the nature of the boundaries have to actually be redrawn, right? In existing relationships. So that's a way of looking or asking oneself, and is there a relationship that exists that now all of a sudden has become kind of, call it uncomfortable or loaded with a lot more tension than before, and kind of seeing has the nature of the relationship, the roles of each person within it, have they also changed? And then that becomes a point of beginning to reflect on, what needs to change, what new boundary needs to be set.
Well, then how can you tell between like a healthy boundary and one that is rigid, right? Because it almost sounds like with any boundary that we're setting in an interpersonal relationship, there's gonna be some kind of imposition, right? Like our boundaries or our decision to set one will inevitably impact a relationship and then that dynamic. So how another person responds to that, right? And so at what point do we, I don't know, like, do we know when it's like, okay, this is healthy, this is worth that to me, or now it is kind of getting into that territory of being controlling, especially when it is maybe a closer, more intimate relationship.
I think Casey Davis, I think I talked about her in our last podcast. She nails this on the head with Who Deserves Your Love, where she talks about like, as humans, we all have a responsibility to respect everyone's dignity. Um, and that means like refraining from acting with malice or, enabling suffering to the other person or degradation. So like it can be really uncomfortable to set a boundary. But you still, have to respect the dignity of the other person and not engage in like harmful behavior.
Yeah, and And I think oftentimes boundaries get confused with control, right? Like you mentioned that a little bit, right? Like sometimes people will think, well, my boundary is I don't want you to behave in this way, or I don't want you to do this thing, or I don't want you to do that thing. And it's like, that's not really a boundary, that's control. And so if you're finding yourself controlling someone else's behavior, then it's like reflecting on like, okay, where is the actual boundary as opposed to where is my control of the other person?
And with what, let's say, state of emotional regulation are you thinking of or setting, communicating a certain boundary, right? That sense that I'm thinking of like an example in the workplace, let's say, where you've had it enough, you've had it up to here, you haven't communicated certain needs up to that point, but then you find yourself kind of in an impulsive way, kind of counter reacting and let's say setting a boundary or stating certain things that are very much in the moment. That's kind of, let's say, call it an unhealthy boundary in the sense that it's not coming from a place where you've let's say thought out and tapped into yourself from a vantage point of not being like so taken by emotions that you're not really thinking in a more, let's say, long-term way about what this boundary means. So just adding on to that, let's say the quality of the emotion that comes with wanting to set a certain boundary.
Yeah. What I would say, like, kind of like to kind of build on that too, I think like, boundaries are flexible and they depend on context. Um, but, like when you think about healthy boundaries, I kind of almost like see it as like that like circle of friendship. It's like you may have certain people that prove to you, over time that maybe they don't really belong in like the close circle of friends that you want to have and talk about personal things. And so maybe you move them out into that outer circle, but that can change. They can grow, they can become different people, and eventually you may kind of bring them back in. Kind of an example of like a rigid boundary, I think, is often like when you're trying to protect yourself from a vulnerability and may actually be harmful. So like I think, for example, in the context of like friendship, when let's say you say, oh, I'm a wall, or I never talk about my feelings with anybody. Well, that can be quite rigid and inflexible, which can, kind of lead to other issues, like maybe you feel isolated or, not connected to people. And so you have to be cautious of like, okay, is this boundary, helping me to maintain a sense of autonomy and a sense of connection? Or is it preventing me in some ways from, let's say, connecting with people? Yeah.
Yeah, that reminds me of like some of the Gottman, the couples therapy ideology, how like it's not about winning or losing. If you're setting a boundary to like win or lose, you've already lost. And it's more like, how do I express myself? How do we connect? How do we share those values and feelings and like come to a place that feels okay for both of us?
Yeah, and in a very similar theme, it's like unless someone's talking about setting a boundary in the context of a relationship that they're kind of fully willing to burn for whatever number of reasons, uh, there is the relationship that exists after a certain boundary is set, right? So the high wire act of kind of finding like, okay, what is a good and healthy boundary both for me and this relationship? So much involves like the first part of tapping into your own needs and what you're trying to protect, but also some kind of exercise of empathy for how the other person would experience it. And how easy is that to confuse with like, well, if that other person experiences something negative, then, then there's something wrong with that. No, sometimes there might be a negative reaction, but what can really refine a boundary to be one that would hopefully, let's say, not burn bridges is one where even as you're thinking about how it's set, thinking about it from the vantage point of the other person as well, right?
Yeah, that's a tough one because, and especially I'm thinking about like even like the child parent relationship with like like kids who move out or whatever, and they're like, I need to set my boundary, protect my peace from my parents because they drive me crazy, so I need to set these boundaries, right? But like keep in mind too, there's already this like established dynamic through your upbringing that now it's like, there's there could potentially be a fragmentation from this boundary, right? And so how like people react whenever there are changes in a relationship, especially when they don't have control over it. And sometimes maybe people don't have the kind of relationship with a parent they do with like a partner where they can talk about these things and like, okay, well, when I feel this way, I set this boundary. And so I know this can be impacting you, and having more of that understanding. It's more like, I just need to protect myself here, and hoping we can still maintain a relationship, and hopefully it'll benefit the relationship, right? But I think there's always maybe a bit of that kind of uncertainty around what's going to happen in the relationship, which makes a lot of sense. It's kind of scary, that uncertainty of how someone might react to that. Which brings me to this other question of like, if boundaries are meant to be helpful, why does it sometimes leave us feeling guilty, or feeling selfish for implementing them?
Well, I think we're social beings by nature, right? So, like when we feel like we're impacting someone else, even if it's for our benefit, we feel a sense of guilt. We feel a sense of like selfishness, or like, what if I'm not doing the right thing? And if they react negatively, that makes it even worse, right? So, like, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't exist. Doesn't mean the boundary shouldn't exist, or that it isn't necessary for your protection. And so like it's sort of going back to that, like reminding yourself of your values, reminding yourself of how you feel in your body, reminding yourself of all of these things and the reasons that you got there in the first place, as opposed to, and allowing and acknowledging like, yeah, I feel guilty and I feel selfish in this moment, but that doesn't mean it's the wrong thing to do.
Yeah. I think so often, like that whole idea of like, if you feel bad, maybe it means there's something wrong. I think that can sometimes, I think like often people think, oh, I shouldn't do this, if I feel bad. But I think sometimes what happens is like you're reacting to an unknown of some kind, and that can feel really scary. And it's really normal to, especially if we're not used to setting boundaries with certain people, to feel concern for what that's going to look like. And also, I think it's also true that it can change the relationship. And, also recognizing that that doesn't mean that you did something wrong, or that there's an issue with the boundary, but that may just reflect how necessary the boundary was.
To honoring like all the aspects of your identity, like how you were raised, that might make it hard to set a boundary, what life events you've been through, if there's trauma, what like cultural aspects of your life influence that, like that can all make it different to set boundaries, whether that's easier or more difficult, like those all have different implications for people too.
Yeah, even with that, Len, I know Jess, you were talking about it, like staying true to your values and reminding yourself of that. How do we, and maybe something in the work that we do as clinicians, whether it's with a client or with a friend, what can we say to someone who's having trouble setting a boundary and maintaining that boundary, especially when it's in the context of a relationship, an important relationship, and they feel like it's jeopardizing maybe some parts of that?
Which reminds me of like DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, with like the clarifying the objectives in a relationship, where I think like at first you have to kind of know what the goal is before you set a boundary. And like John Lucas said, and you don't say something hastily out of a reaction, and really take that step back to be like, what is my goal? Like, am I focusing on the relationship? Am I focusing on my needs? Am I focusing on some other outcome? And, how do my values and everything tie into that?
Yeah, I think that's a big piece with DBT. Because I know when you're deciding on an objective, it does change the course of action, right? Like if the priority is like relationship preservation, we're going to go into it with a very different kind of mindset, right? Like we're open to negotiation. We really want to hear what the other person is saying. Not to say that, let's say, if your priority is more so, self-respect, or really kind of like prioritizing yourself, you wouldn't do those things, but maybe you wouldn't be going in with the mindset of like, I'm open to negotiating this. Like, this is like a non-negotiable for me. I want to hear what you have to say about it. Like, if I'm asking for a raise at work and it's something that I feel like I deserve, I obviously want, and it's important that I keep a good relationship with my boss, but this is going to be something I'm not going to negotiate on, because this is about my value. This is about self-respect, and that is my ultimate priority here.
Yeah, this is, I think, for the most part, a synthesis of what everyone's already shared. But in the context of, let's say, working with a therapist on, let's say, a boundary-related question, I mean, what you might find, it could be valuable work with your therapist, is simply kind of talking about, let's say, and I think Rebecca touched on this particularly, the uncertainty piece and the fact that if this is a relationship in your life, it's because you care about the relationship in some capacity. So what's there behind that? We are social creatures, as Jess said, such that, you know, any kind of social loss will inherently be registered in our nervous system as something bad. But that doesn't necessarily mean that, you're not carving out some, let's say, better future for who you want to be if you have to set that boundary. Um, so I really look at boundaries as the kind of thing that, like, 9 times out of 10, there will invariably be feelings of discomfort that come with it because nobody likes uncertainty and nobody likes uncertainty around social decay. Let's call it that. And then there might be even like, depending on the exact nature of your boundary issue and what you're kind of coming to therapy with. Oftentimes there's a lot of, and as I think Jen alluded to this, a lot of, let's say, uh, implied cultural or even, let's say, attachment history based scripts around what it means to set a boundary. If you haven't been used to setting them because for whatever reason you've inhabited roles, let's say mother, daughter, where, let's say, pleasing others has kind of been defined in a lot of different places, then you're not used to setting boundaries. Or you've had less opportunities for that. And so that just magnifies, let's say, the discomfort that comes with that. So well, I think that's just a cross section of the different ways in which boundaries themselves can be kind of explored in your work with your therapist.
Yeah, and I would just kind of like build on that too. Like, I think that uncertainty is really scary, obviously. I think one thing to maybe kind of soothe that in some way, or maybe to kind of work through that, is also like looking at what you do know to be true right now without the boundaries, and maybe assessing, okay, well, what is the risk of not having a boundary? What would be the potential benefits of holding a boundary? And kind of looking at like risk versus cost, because any decision we make will have risks and costs to them, but do they outweigh what is currently happening? And maybe that can be a good place to start when deciding whether or not that feels feasible.
Yeah, so that's a good way to end. Thank you everyone for joining today in this conversation on boundaries. If anyone has any questions, you can always reach out to us, or you can always book a free consultation with any one of these therapists. We'd be happy to talk more about boundaries. Anyway, bye for now until our next meeting.
Okay.
Bye.